cinema, I see a very mainstream film. But I would like that experience for people, for the white men in the world who are seeing themselves all the time, to also get to exercise empathy by seeing films that are exploring other lives.
The second of your broad themes is emphasising structural racism as opposed to individual bigotry. Can you just explain to me about that?
Well, I think a lot of the reason that we go to the cinema and watch television at the end of the day is about escapism, it's about soothing, it's about feeling better. And that's fine, I do it too, and it's a good thing. But that has meant that there's been this tendency towards a happy ending in Hollywood, particularly towards peace over justice, shall we say, so that you want everything to be resolved in a nice, neat fashion, or you'll have a storyline like the classic one that I talk about in my book is the kind of interracial buddy cop movie, so like Lethal Weapon, where these two guys from the other small side of the track get together at the end and everything's solved.
It's a sort of chained together genre, that, isn't it?
Yeah.
Because it starts with, The Heat of the Night, Sidney Poitier and Rod Steiger.
Yeah.
The Defiant Ones, they're literally chained together.
Yeah.
And you get a sort of, as it were, a bigot
Yeah.
and a black
Yeah.
person or a person of colour. And by the end it's solved. But it's done at an individual level.
Yes, exactly. And it didn't end in the 50s either. We right up to the Green Book, which won the Oscar just a couple of years ago, we're seeing that same narrative, which kind of acts to soothe white people's sense that racial injustice has happened, that they may be in some way complicit in it, but without actually talking to how we would solve these racial injustices.
It's not a huge solution either, is it? Because what it essentially means is that you have a kind of racist within the fiction who by the end grudgingly goes, oh, well, I can see you're all right,
exactly.
but hasn't surrendered the racism at all.
Yeah, it's very, very superficial. And also it's again about the white person's own kind of personal journey rather than thinking about how the racism might be impacting the black person and that sort of thing.
And the third of your categories is disseminating a deeper understanding of race and whiteness. Now that's a much more complicated notion, I think.
Yeah.
Could you explain that?
Well, I think that we have this idea, the sort of colloquial understanding of race, which is that it's fixed. These are fixed subcategories of humanity. And actually, that's not scientifically true. Like, there is no genetic basis for dividing human beings according to the colour of their skin or any kind of racialised physical features. And I think cinema is actually, because it's a visual medium, can be really good at exploring those areas where we see that race is actually mutable and not fixed and changing, and that it's politically and historically and socially constructed rather than being fixed. I'm talking about, like, there's a great number of passing narratives.
This is where characters who sort of look white, mixed race characters who look white, adopt a white persona.
Persona, which is a historical thing that made more sense in kind of the segregated south of America, say, or in societies like that. But that's a thing that maybe in some kind of metaphorical way still happens, or in some kind of narrative ways. But it's also, these stories are quite an interesting way of exploring that race isn't fixed, and that sometimes people who look white might be black, and some people who look black might be white.
And then, I mean, literally, if you use black and white film, as in a film passing,
yes,
you can blur those.
Rebecca Hall made a film of Nella Larsen's 1929 book, Passing, quite recently in 2020, I think it was, and she used the very medium of cinema, and this is what I mean when I say these tools can be repurposed, to show that someone in certain contexts and in certain lights looks different, and their racial identity looks different.
Can you explain the difference, because you touch on it in the book, between colour-blind casting and colour-conscious casting? Because they're two different things, aren't they?
Yeah, so colour-blind casting, a classic example would be something like The Personal History of David Copperfield, the Mandy Iannucci's film, which I think does it very well, or something like Bridgerton, where basically you just cast whoever you want in the role, and you don't take account of things like whether it's plausible that they would be related to someone with a totally different skin shade than, or whether a person of that race would have that status in society at that point. So it's on the level of the screen, deep level, if you like, entirely. Whereas colour-conscious casting takes into account the story and the history, and so it's diversity on a storytelling, a much deeper storytelling level as well.
Now, those two things are at odds with each other, aren't they? One is acknowledging that cinema has broadly been a kind of realistic medium, that mostly that's how it's operated, because it's photographic. The other is sort of saying, well, actually, it's a medium of storytelling like any other, and we can make our own decisions. But they're at odds with each other.
Well, I think colour-blind casting can be really kind of radical in that what it actually acknowledges is that we're always suspending our disbelief on one level at something or another. You know, maybe it's dragons in Game of Thrones or whatever, and why not suspend it about this other aspect? You know?
Do you see the suspension is greater in some cases than others? You know that when Jodie Turner-Smith played Anne Boleyn, you know, she's a black actor, and she played Anne Boleyn. That involves a much greater suspension of disbelief than when you watch David Copperfield, say, in which all the characters are fictional.
Yeah, I guess so. But I think there's a sort of myth around historical accuracy in period drama that I think most historians will tell you no period dramas are historically accurate in any real or meaningful way because we don't know a lot of the stuff, or because it's simply impossible to recreate it, or for all sorts of other storytelling.
But you know some things.
We do know some things, yeah. We know, but also it could. So in the case of Jodie Turner-Smith playing Anne Boleyn, it might help us understand a deeper truth about that character, i.e. her religious differences from the rest of society in a way that it's difficult for us to understand in this day and age because that doesn't exist.
I mean, period drama obviously involves a kind of negotiation between fictions and ideas about kind of authenticity and truth and so on. There are a lot of genres like science fiction, like fantasy, that don't, and yet they still get into trouble, don't they? Or they have done recently, because of diversity.
Because because, and this is the case of period dramas too, it's not actually about accuracy, it's about plausibility, it's about what the audience was willing to believe is true. And my contention is that film and TV shapes that and should take responsibility for shaping it. That when like someone like Lawrence Fox says that he has his suspension of disbelief interrupted by seeing the South Asian actor, or South Asian origin actor Naguan Rizwan wearing a turban in 1917 because there weren't any Indian soldiers in the First World War. That's historically nonsense, but he believes that because he's seen a lot of very whitewashed films about the First World War.
Yes, but that is a different thing, isn't it, again, from, say, Guardians of the Galaxy, or indeed, you know, Ncuti Gatwa playing Doctor Who, which gets a reaction from some quarters. I mean, it's difficult to understand it because it's an entirely fantasy world.
It is difficult. I mean, a lot of that stuff is to do with people's very deep feelings of ownership about childhood. You know, like we call it IP, intellectual property. Like the sort of the characters, and like in the case of Doctor Who, people feel a sense of ownership and they don't like it being changed. And often that, if you want to change something, you have to change it.
People find change difficult. Period. You know, and change, like, you know. But people accepted Bridgerton, but it must have been quite a shock because that was a radical thing. And without Bridgerton, because I used to have this issue with lots of period drama that so how is a black actor going to get any work? You know what I mean?
But do you see Bridgerton, in which is a very kind of mixed cast? Do you see that as colour conscious casting, in that they were going back and sort of saying actually these people have been erased from most period dramas when they were there?
Yeah.
Or do you see it as colour-blind casting?
Bridgerton is colour-blind casting, which about halfway through the first series attempts to change into colour-conscious casting by having this sort of weird fudge where they say, the reason that black people have this status in society is because the white king fell in love with a black woman, and that sort of racism, which it has its own problems because it's not a very realistic idea of how racism might be solved.
And what about genre as a tool, as a Trojan horse? You quote the Australian filmmaker Leah Purcell, talking about her film The Drover's Wife, and she uses that term, Trojan horse. She has this very good analogy. You're on a ride at a fun park, and when the guardrail comes down, you're locked into that ride, so you just sort of go in.
Yeah.
And that has been used by black filmmakers, hasn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, Jordan Peele particularly, to use genre to sort of say, stop worrying, something's going to happen.
I love that because I love it because I love genre films and I like going to see them, and also because I think there's this, in talking about race, there's often this sort of heaviness that comes with it, or this sort of worthiness, or it's like, everyone's going on about race again. But like, actually, I think this is a really interesting and vital conversation, and that it can be a source of humour, or like there's just lots of different ways to understand it. It's fascinating, so I like it when filmmakers have fun with it.
Noura Niassari, can I bring you in? Noura, can you hear me?
Yes, of course.
Because you made, I just wondered what you felt about this aspect of the genre. You made a short called Tam, which was sort of used thriller elements in the story.
Yes, it was a one-shot. It was a one-shot thriller.
And you're going to be making a road movie. So they can be very useful, can't they, as ways of getting an audience to, as it were, stop worrying and just watch.
I mean, I guess I'm struggling at the moment in terms of the current climate in wanting to, you know, inherently say something with my work, and being faced with the current dilemma, which is that a drama is not necessarily a desirable genre at the moment in the marketplace, and so, but I find it especially so with you know, films from people of color, films about race, films about difficult subject matter, that there's this new requirement or a desire to like package it into a genre in order to make it palatable for audiences, and you know, I find it challenging because I don't feel like, you know, filmmakers such as, obviously they're amazing and great filmmakers, Martin Scorsese, the Christopher Nolans, they're not needing to package their stories into, you know, a particular like new genre. Like they don't need to like traverse a new terrain in order to tell the stories they don't want to tell, that they want to tell. So I don't know, I'm finding it really challenging at the moment because, you know, we want to tell our stories, but there's certain conditions for it to be palatable for.
There are sometimes conditions in the other
studios.
direction, though, aren't there? I don't know whether you've seen American Fiction yet.
I have, yeah.
Ellen. But that is a you know, Cord Jefferson's film from Percival Everett's novel, which is about a writer who finds himself cramped in the other direction by notions of authenticity and having to represent a certain style of...
Yeah, this has historically been the case for a lot of black filmmakers, that in order to get any kind of awards recognition, certainly they have to be about a serious topic. They have to be about slavery, or they have to be about civil rights activism. And why shouldn't, as Nora says, why shouldn't artists of colour be able to make art about whatever they want, however trivial and you know, and frivolous, just as white filmmakers have done?
I want to move on to Nora, but just before I do, I mean, there's the burden of representation is one of the issues here, isn't there? I mean, you quote
That's right.
Alim Khan, who made After Love, a wonderful film. But he identified the burden of representation goes with the scarcity of representation. If you're the only Muslim filmmaker who's going to make a film that year, then you feel a sort of weight of responsibility to do everything.
Yeah, and that's why I'm always trying to open the conversation up to talk about the totality of our film and screen culture and TV culture in the industry, rather than saying, oh, Top Boy's really bad because it stereotypes black people, or whatever the case may be. That programme or that film, often if it exists in a constellation of all different kinds of films made by people of colour, and that particular group is being represented, that burden is eased and it can just live.
Noura Niyasari, tell me about Shaida. It's dedicated to your mother and to the women of Iran. How biographical is it?
So, you know, Shaida is inspired by my mother and I's experience of living in an Australian women's shelter in the 90s. And I would say that the film is emotionally autobiographical in that, you know, in the making of a piece of, you know, cinema, of, you know, fiction, there's obviously changes that happen. It becomes less about you know, it being a factual representation of your life and more about creating a cinematic experience for an audience. But you know, it was a very challenging thing to do, to kind of walk that blurry line of reality and fiction, all the while trying to keep it as authentic and truthful to the experience.
It's being selected to represent Australia in the international film category at the Oscars. Do you think of it as an Australian film or an Iranian film, or do those categories just not, are they not relevant at all?
I see Shader as an Australian film. You know, it's set in Australia. The story is, you know, wouldn't have been possible in Iran. It's very much, yeah, of the context that we were in Australia. We wouldn't have had that safety and freedom in Iran. So and of course it was funded by Australia. We had an Australian crew. We had majority Australian cast. Only one of our cast members was from overseas, which is Zahra Amir Ebrahimi, who is a French-Iranian actress who won Best Actress at Cannes for Holy Spider the year before we shot. So last year, actually. And so, yeah, it's a wholly Australian production, and I'm really proud to call it an Australian film because I think it's reflective of you know, changes that are happening in terms of you know, representation in our industry here.
And yet, the Iranian elements in it are absolutely crucial to it. It's about the mother's struggle to sort of break away from her culture and yet at the same time stay connected to it for her daughter. She has to break away because she's, you know, she can't go back to Iran. She would lose contact with her daughter if she did. She can't easily get divorced. She's in a woman's shelter, but she doesn't want her daughter to lose contact with her culture.
Yes, that's right. I mean, I would say that my primary objective was capturing the experience of escaping domestic violence, you know, for any given culture, for any given, because it's a universal experience, as we know, it happens everywhere. And of course, you know, being an Iranian raised woman, and this experience being so personal, the cultural elements definitely became vital to the storytelling. You talk about her breaking away from her culture, and you know, in some ways that's true, but it's also so much about reclaiming, you know, parts of her culture that you know, have otherwise been conditional. So
well,
so
Nowruz is very
New Year, and
yeah, it's a very important celebration, that, isn't it? And
yes,
it shapes the film in many
it's,
ways.
It's the framework for the movie. It takes place over the 2 weeks of Persian New Year, and it allows there to be a lightness to the film and a celebration of culture and joy, and yeah, that a woman can, you know, choose the parts of her culture to sustain her in finding freedom and self-determination in the world.
It also gives you a very gives you a very wonderful on-screen metaphor for passing through a period of trial and emerging. The fire jumping is part of the Persian New Year, isn't it? Can you just explain that element of it?
Yeah, so Persian New Year, it's about new beginnings. You know, in Iran, it's during springtime. It's during the spring equinox, and it's a really symbolic part of our culture because it you know, it's pre-Islamic time. So we've been with Persian New Year traditions for thousands of years, and you know, so much of it is about renewal and rebirth and you know, letting go of what was. But you know, for me, growing up in Australia, it always took place during autumn because obviously we're in the southern hemisphere, and so that metaphor and that contextual rendering was so important to the film because of the isolation. It's so much more exaggerated when you're, you know, experiencing your, you know, a cultural celebration in an opposite context from where your family is, and so, you know, the metaphor just became all that more rich and complex.
You talked before about this being a universal story, and I just wanted to unpick that slightly, the idea of universal appeal, because of course it is there are many stories that have that, and any film is going to need to have that. But I wonder what you feel about universal appeal as a kind of concept, because it also has a slightly flattening effect, doesn't it?
Yeah. Well, I guess what I get slightly concerned, stroke irritated about is when universal is used as a kind of euphemism for I, the film critic, personally relate to this story, and therefore it must be universal, which is a problem when most film critics are from one particular demographic, or mostly kind of middle-class white blokes with a sprinkling of middle-class white women as well. So and I don't think that's what Noura's doing at all. But I think it's something it's worth saying. Is this really universal, or is it just that you relate to it as a critic?
Noura, did you want to come back on that?
No, I completely understand your point of view there, and you know, when I talk about universal, or when people within my film do, it's because the film ultimately is about a mother and daughter, right? And it's a love letter to mothers and daughters, and a woman finding freedom. And I didn't see the film as that universal until I started screening it at film festivals and cinemas around the world, and having deep connections with complete strangers who had such similar experiences to my mother and I, and realizing that this is everyone's story. That in a sense is what I mean by the film being universal.
I thought that there was a lovely metaphor, and I'd be interested to know how consciously you intended this, of like the kind of the woman who's fleeing domestic violence, and how she feels torn to go between going back to what she knows in terms of her ex-partner, even though she knows he will kill her, and also the woman or the individual fleeing their home and unable to go back to that home because also it might kill her. I thought that was a really interesting parallel that was explored in the film.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think the women's shelter, it's a unifying place in a way, because these women, they're from all different racial backgrounds, all different socioeconomic circumstances, but they're really unified by a shared trauma and shared desire for autonomy and self-determination. And so there is this kind of family, kind of sisterhood that forms within the shelter, which is a world that I personally hadn't seen on screens before, and that I felt when you're talking before about responsibility, I felt a responsibility to bring that to screens in an authentic way, having survived and lived through that experience myself. And so I'm really proud of that, because it's giving a lot of women in various parts of the world the ability to find strength and power, and to know that they don't have to live in silence and shame, that they can come forward and share their stories.
With any luck as well, Noura, some men will be looking at it too, and maybe.
Absolutely.
I wanted to ask you something, Noura. We know there are wonderful Iranian directors working inside Iran, but not able to show their films, or working in exile outside Iran. I just wondered whether you knew about, because we've been talking about the master's tools, all of these elements, storytelling, can be used in the other direction. I assume that Iranian popular television is reinforcing the regime's worldview, and that Iranian popular film may be reinforcing the regime's view. Do you know what's shown inside Iran?
What's shown inside Iran is what passes censorship. So, which is limited. There's a lot of incredible films that are made in Iran that play at international film festivals, but don't get permission to screen in Iran. And that's a huge dilemma for filmmakers there, because obviously they're not able to make back the kind of money that they need to sustain their careers. They're not able to share you know, share the message of their films within their own country. So it only becomes for a Western audience, which is really really a terrible thing.
And I assume that Iranians are seeing things on television that kind of, as it were, engineer the human soul in other directions. I want to bring Hugh Locke in now, because you've got this installation in the Royal Academy's new show, Entangled Pasts, called Armada. It's a wonderful installation. 45 boats, I think the number
45,
changes. Just tell us about it. It's got rafts, it's got tramp steamers, fishing boats, 18th century ships of the line, suspended in the gallery space.
Yeah, so they're suspended, floating, heading in a direction. We don't know which direction they're going. They're sort of found boats all over the place, which have been heavily customized, some built from scratch. And it's about different sections of history floating along. So it's the present floating alongside the past. And it's the ghosts of the past and the ghosts and the reality of the present as well.
Is it an artwork that's grown? Has it grown larger over the years?
It has grown. You know,
and will it continue to grow?
No, it stopped now because it belongs to Tate Gallery. So that puts a full stop to the whole thing.
And I mean, you've implied it already, but there are specific historic vessels here as well as
yes, specific historic vessels. So there's the Bounty, HMS Bounty, and when I think of that, I think of the fact that they were going and bringing back breadfruit as cheap food for slaves. I mean, but it's all torn. All these boats are torn and tattered and broken.
That's it. They're salt stained and rusted.
Exactly, rusted, but also with gold pieces on them and stuff like that. Images of things like ranging from Benin bronze figures to Benin masks. I mean, the images of pre-Columbian gold objects. It's quite a wide-ranging thing. It's like a floating poem, I suppose you could call it that.
You've used some toys as the raw material here, and that's part of the charm of this piece. It seems to me it touches that bit in us that likes models.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, there's something about a model boat which you can hold in your hand, but you can also hold it in your mind. And the fact that these boats are all battered and weather worn, and there's nobody on them, no little figures, nothing like that. So the people on the boats is you, the viewer.
This is a piece that's been shown in many different places, different galleries.
It's shown, yeah.
And we were talking earlier about kind of universal appeal. It seems to me it's an artwork that can go in all sorts of directions. Shown in this particular exhibition, it's narrowed down a little. We we inevitably think of slave ships or refugee ships because of the context. Do you mind that?
No, because they can be taken out and put in a different context. It's a flexible piece of work, basically. And it can have different connotations in different places. I mean, and obviously the piece right now is surrounded by historical paintings, amazing historical paintings, I hasten to add. So it's a very specific feel to it, but it was shown in Liverpool, and it had a different feel. This is the first time it's been shown in London, so it's a different thing somehow.
It is. I would urge people to go and have a look at it because it's a wonderful work.
One of the things that excited me about the exhibition as a whole and Hugh's piece in particular was kind of trying to work out what I was bringing to it from my own personal history and sort of projecting into it, and what is intended by the artist. So like with Hugh's piece, I was thinking of the Christopher Nolan film Dunkirk, and then that because of all the floats together.
Exactly.
and I was also looking at all the paintings. So I would think that I recognised in these often unnamed anonymous black subjects or subjects of colour this kind of subversive, defiant humanity that maybe the artist hadn't intended but was just there anyway because of the subject. And I was wondering how much of that was there and what I was bringing to it.
A lot of things are what the audience completes a piece of work, and you cannot dictate how an audience will react to something. And I found that out quite a bit during my career. Like, you make a piece of work and then you put it out there, and you don't know how people are going to react. But that thing you mentioned about Dunkirk, the title Armada is referring to the fear of invasion, but Armada just means armed, and then there's a Chilean Armada, and that's the Chilean National Fleet.
And Armada, I think, was also very often used about the D-Day invasion, where it was going in the other direction.
Exactly. And the whole debate about small boats, back in, I was very conscious of that when the piece was being made, thinking about small ships.
Mm. Do you mind, I mean, you just said black subjects there, but in one sense it's not a black subject, it is a world subject. It's a subject that everybody will have some experience of, and maybe a black viewer will have a slightly different experience. I remember, I think it was Lubana Himid recently expressed some discontent. Had always been called, you know, the first black winner of the term, because she wanted artists to come first.
Yes.
And I wonder what you felt about that. Does being called a black artist inevitably narrow the way in which people respond to your work?
Oh God, I think about that all the time. I mean, yes, I don't know. I mean, I just make my work.
What do you flop between then in thinking about it all the time?
I try to squeeze my way between categorizations, so it's trying not to be tied down. And yeah, it's not simple.
My solution is...
Sorry, Noura just wanted to come in there, I think.
Oh, I identify with that so much. Being that hyphenate artist, filmmaker, it's a constant dilemma, and I feel like society is so hell-bent and determined for you to identify where you sit between those two worlds, and especially in your work, and it's just so much pressure. I find it's kind of suffocating sometimes.
And are there ways out of that pressure? How do you find a way out of that pressure?
I mean, for me personally, the way out of the pressure is just to make the work I want to make, and then see what the reaction is, but it is not simple. It isn't simple, because no matter what, basically, to be honest with you, you have to chuck all this crap out of your brain to be able to actually make something, and there's so many people, and most artists will call them as finest, where there's people sitting on your shoulder, get rid of this person on the shoulder, get rid of that person, all the noise in the brain, and you get rid of that, and then it's like, okay, fine, what's left is where we're at.
Yeah, I just think that's exactly right, and this is not a problem for the artists themselves. This is, as speaking as an arts critic and